So far, you've learned verbs in Greek that have regular patterns of endings. Just like any language, however, there are a certain number that have irregular endings, although even these usually fit into a pattern with Greek. This chapter isn't going to give you more endings to learn, but we are going to look at changing stems to reconfigure things to give you how irregular verbs work. So, where is the problem? Consider the following things in English. I look today. Yesterday I looked. Today I wash. Yesterday I washed. We are taught that you add ed on the end of an English present to form a basic past tense that is akin to the aorist. But what about sit? Sat. You've changed the vowel. Eat. Ate. You've reconfigured it slightly. It's recognisable but different. Read. Read. You've changed the pronunciation but not actually the writing. So there are changes there, but they're subtle and difficult to see. Go. Went. It's a completely different word. Harking back to two different verbs in English that have merged to become part of the same paradigm. Think of the English word wend, to wend your way somewhere. And you can see where went might have come from. So in English, we have irregular verbs, and they follow a certain number of patterns. Think about sing, sang, sung, or hang, hung, or run, ran. Particularly in terms of vowel interchange, we have pretty established patterns for dealing with our irregular verbs. What we've got to think about now is how you do that in Greek. This slide is going to give you a basic parallel between the two different patterns. You've learned luo, and then augmenting lu on, and then augmenting and adding a sigma, and then an alpha for the aorist. In the irregular, we'll take lambano, which means I take or receive. Lambano in the present, that's still the same. Imperfect, elambanon. What we do in the aorist is we change the stem, we still augment, and now we repeat those imperfect endings. So it's the stem here, the difference between lamban and lab, that tells you it's either imperfect or aorist, and not the ending. Same endings, different stem. That's your basic pattern, one of two patterns that you can do. In Duff, you've got a chart on page 125 of the different kinds of things that can happen there. You'll see lambano in that first pattern where we shortened the stem. And the same shortening you'll see happens with manthan, math, or hamartan, hemart. Losing an extra syllable is quite a common thing to do. If you look at ballo, you've lost a lambda. If you look at lepo or feugo, then you lose an epsilon. There's a pretty consistent pattern of losing things to move between tenses. One interesting one is apothnesko, heorisco, pasco, possibly as well. SK is always going to get lost. SK is a process marker. If you see SK, it's like the word cresco in Latin, which means I grow, for example. Think about a crescent moon. And that process marker can only be there in a process tense. The aorist is a simple one, not a continuous one. So one of the things that will happen in these strong aorists, these second aorists, these irregular verbs, is that you will lose any process markers. So some textbooks suggest you actually start with the idea of the aorist, because it's the aorist that gives you your basic form of the verb, and it's the present that then possibly extends that with things like the ban, than, tan, infixes, the extra syllables that mark it as procedural, or the ska. So the first and possibly the largest class of verbs that you're going to meet shorten their stem, and that's quite often removing something that you will come to recognise as a marker of continuous language. There are two special verbs that we'll deal with on another slide. These are called root aorists. They're a bit special and do their own thing. There are some where the adjustment to the stem is not quite as simple as shortening. Ago, you actually increase the stem. Echo has a long history, which I can explain for anyone who's interested, but you're increasing it from a chi to a sigma chi. And pipto, giving you epeson, is, according to Duff, related but different. Ginomai egenomen is a similar idea. You move from gin to gen. Then there are verbs like the English go went, erchomai elthon, lego apon. There are a couple over the page in the book. I haven't added them in here. You've got estheo ephagon. And if you think of, for example, the English word phagocyte or necrophage, you can see that often derivations come from the aorist stem. So if you can remember words like phagocyte or necrophage because you're a biologist at heart, then you might find learning some of these irregular ones a bit easier. Horao gives you adon. And adon is going to be linked to things like idol. We'll have that root underneath it. So, or indeed video, which I can show you how that works if you're interested. So that id is the same id as in vid, video, IC. So again, it's not a completely bizarre ending there. And then ferro, which is completely annoying. That's your basic introduction to irregular verbs. Strong aorists, second aorists. Let's have a look at how the whole paradigm pans out. So you've learned luo, lues, lue, luomen, lueta, luusin. And the present is the same. And then you've learned imperfect, augment them all, ebalon, ebales, ebale, ebalomen, ebalate, ebalon, eluon, elues, elue, eluomen, eluon. The imperfect is the same. It's in the aorist we have a change. You're still going to augment, but now we've changed the stem so it only has one lambda in it. And your standard imperfect endings go back on. So if you were reading ebalon, you'd have to check very carefully, is it a double lambda or a single lambda, because that will change the tense. The endings are the same as the imperfect, but the stem is different. In the imperative, infinitive and participle, well, you haven't got an imperfect version of those, so you can't import the imperfect endings. What we do instead is we use the present endings. So the present imperative, bale, balete, becomes bale, balete with one L. The infinitive, balein with two L's, becomes balein with one L. The participle, balone, becomes balone with one L. So you really need to pay attention to the stem you're expecting, not just the endings, in order to differentiate between present and aorist or imperfect and aorist. This is the main way in which your irregular verbs will work. I'd like you now to have a go at practice 11.1.4 and practice 11.1.5. I will put 11.1.4 into this video, and I will put 11.1.5 up for you to look at separately.